Imagine driving home after a long day of work, thinking only about dinner and rest, when suddenly flashing blue lights appear in your rearview mirror. Your heart skips a beat. You haven't done anything wrong, yet the sight of a police car pulling you over sends shivers down your spine. Now imagine that this simple stop will not only change your night, but it will change someone's career forever. That's exactly what happened to Judge Angela Williams. Angela was not just any driver on the road. She was a respected judge, known for her calm presence in the courtroom and her reputation for being fair, balanced, and deeply committed to justice. For over a decade, she had dedicated her life to making sure that truth prevailed, that the innocent were protected, and that the guilty faced their consequences. She was the kind of person who inspired confidence in the law. But on this particular evening, as she drove her sleek black sedan down a quiet suburban street, none of that mattered. To the flashing lights behind her, she wasn't a judge. She wasn't a leader in her community. She was just another driver who suddenly looked suspicious. Angela's hands tightened around the steering wheel as she eased her car to the side of the road. A wave of unease washed over her, not because she had anything to hide, but because she knew all too well how quickly simple situations could spiral out of control. She took a deep breath, telling herself to stay calm, to let the process play out. After all, she had nothing to fear. Or so she thought. The officer stepped out of his patrol car, walking toward her vehicle with a brisk, authoritative stride. His flashlight beam cut through the evening air, landing directly on her windshield. Angela rolled down the window, forcing a polite smile as she greeted him. "Good evening, officer," she said softly. But the officer's reply was anything but courteous. His voice carried suspicion, sharp and direct, as though he had already made up his mind before even hearing her speak. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Angela blinked, surprised. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her tone calm but curious. "There sure is," he said, narrowing his eyes. "This car matches the description of a vehicle reported stolen. Registration and license now!" The words struck her like a sudden thunderclap. Stolen? She had owned this car for years, purchased legally, registered under her name. Yet the way the officer stood, the way his voice cut through the air, made it clear he wasn't asking. He was accusing. Angela reached slowly for her purse, careful not to make any sudden movements. She had seen enough in her courtroom to know that perception was everything in these moments, but as she searched for her documents, she could feel his gaze locked on her, cold and unyielding. Inside, her mind raced. Why me? Why this car? Why now? The street grew quieter as a few neighbors peeked through their curtains, curious about the flashing lights outside. Two teenagers walking their dogs stopped to watch, their phones already in hand. Angela noticed them out of the corner of her eye and felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief because there would be witnesses. Dread because this humiliation was unfolding in public. Handing over her license and registration, she expected the officer to glance at them, realize the mistake, and let her go. But instead, his expression hardened further. "These could be fake," he muttered. "People forge documents all the time." Angela's patience thinned, though she kept her voice steady. "Officer, I assure you this vehicle is mine. Perhaps you can run the plates." But the officer didn't budge. He circled the car slowly, inspecting it like a predator stalking prey. Then he returned, his jaw clenched. "Step out. We'll sort this out downtown," he said. Angela's stomach dropped. The idea of being taken in, of being paraded through. A police station like a criminal was not only insulting, it was unthinkable. Her career, her dignity, her very identity were on the line. Yet she knew she couldn't reveal who she was just yet. Not until the right moment. The flashing lights continued to paint the neighborhood in harsh red and blue, while the whispers of onlookers grew louder. The two teenagers now held their phones higher, recording everything. Angela exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain collected. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was turning into something much bigger, Dot. And deep down, she had a chilling realization. This night was only beginning. Asterisk Angela stood frozen for a moment, her mind caught between outrage and disbelief. She had spent years teaching others about the importance of due process, fairness, and the presumption of innocence. Yet, here she was, a judge, being treated as though she were guilty until proven otherwise. Slowly, she stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement. The night air was crisp, and with every breath, she could feel her dignity being tested. The officer loomed over her, clipboard in hand, as if he were ready to document her downfall. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered firmly. Angela complied, raising her hands slightly in a controlled manner. Inside, she was steadying her nerves, aware that the eyes of neighbors and strangers were fixed on her every move. The quiet, suburban street now felt like a stage, and she the unwilling main character of a play she hadn't auditioned for. The officer flipped through her documents again, his eyes darting from the paper to the car and back to her face. His expression carried the look of someone convinced he had caught a criminal in the act. "You're telling me this is your car?" he asked, voice laced with doubt. "Yes," Angela replied calmly. "It's registered under my name. If you check your system, you'll see that." But the officer didn't appear interested in checking. Instead, he leaned closer, scrutinizing her as though every word she spoke was a lie. "These things happen all the time," he muttered. "People with nice cars pretending they belong to them. I've seen it before." Angela's chest tightened. She wanted to reveal her position, to end this charade instantly, but she resisted. Timing was everything. She needed this moment to fully unfold so that the truth, when revealed, would be undeniable, not only to the officer but to every single witness standing nearby. By now, more people had gathered. Porch lights flicked on. Curtains swayed open. A small crowd had formed at a safe distance, their murmurs filling the air, and in almost every hand there was a phone camera recording. The officer seemed aware of the audience, but instead of softening his tone, he grew more rigid. His authority felt bolstered by the attention, as though this scene was his chance to showcase his power. "Turn around," he instructed. "I need to search you before we go any further." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. She wasn't resisting, but her patience was thinning with every second. "Officer," she said firmly, her voice steady, "I think you're making a mistake." His eyes narrowed. "The only mistake is trying to convince me this car is yours. You've got paperwork that doesn't prove anything. People fake this stuff all the time." Her heart sank, not because she feared arrest, but because she saw the blindness of prejudice playing out in real time. She had spent her career exposing bias in the courtroom, reminding juries and prosecutors that assumptions could destroy lives. Yet here she was, facing those very assumptions herself. The teenagers recording whispered to one another. One of them whispered loud enough for her to hear, "She looks like she's telling the truth." Another replied, "Yeah, but he's not listening." Angela glanced at them briefly, then back at the officer. She thought about her years on the bench, the families she had guided through trials, the young people she had tried to protect from unfair judgments. Now she stood in their shoes, realizing, with painful clarity, how powerless it felt to be dismissed without being heard. The officer began pacing around the vehicle again, running his hand across the roof, peering through the windows, scribbling notes on his pad. "Nice car," he said almost under his breath. "Too nice." Angela took a slow, measured breath. She knew his words were not just about the car. They carried something deeper, an assumption that she didn't belong in it, that she couldn't possibly be the rightful owner. The crowd's murmurs grew louder as tension mounted. A neighbor whispered, "That's Judge Williams, isn't it? I've seen her on the news." Another shook their head. "Doesn't matter, he doesn't recognize her, and he doesn't believe her." Angela caught those whispers. They gave her strength. If others could see the absurdity, then the truth would eventually prevail. But the officer wasn't finished. He tapped his radio and called for backup. "Dispatch, this is Officer Daniels. I've got a possible stolen vehicle here, requesting another unit for confirmation." The words echoed down the quiet street. Angela's pulse quickened, not from fear, but from anger. She knew exactly what would happen once more officers arrived. The scene would escalate, the humiliation would deepen, and the false narrative of her as a criminal would solidify further. For the first time, she felt her composure slip slightly. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes flicked toward the flashing lights reflecting off the nearby houses. She thought, "How many times have I heard stories like this in my courtroom? How many times have I told others that justice would prevail? Now it's my turn to believe it." But standing there, with an officer glaring at her as though she were nothing more than a thief, it was getting harder to hold on to that faith. Angela straightened her shoulders, forcing herself to remain calm. The cameras were still rolling. The neighbors were still watching. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a moment that would either expose the truth or bury her under. Suspicion. And as the sound of another patrol car approached in the distance, Angela realized that the night's battle had only just begun. The second patrol car rolled into the neighborhood, its headlights sweeping across front yards and parked vehicles. The flashing lights doubled now, bouncing off windows and painting. The street in alternating red and blue. The quiet suburb had transformed into a stage for something far more dramatic than an ordinary traffic stop. Angela stood beside her car, her hands loosely at her sides, her purse resting on the hood. She had given every document requested, yet the officer, Daniels, looked at her as if she had presented counterfeit bills. His demeanor hadn't softened. If anything, the arrival of backup made him more determined to prove his suspicion was right. From the second vehicle stepped another officer, younger and visibly cautious. He approached, glancing between Angela and Daniels. "What's going on here?" the younger officer asked. Daniels gestured toward Angela's car. "Reported. Stolen vehicle. Suspects trying to pass off fake paperwork as proof of ownership." The word suspect stung. Angela inhaled deeply, steadying her voice before speaking. "I am not a suspect," she said evenly. "This is my vehicle. I've explained that, and I've provided valid identification and registration. If you simply run the plates, you'll see." The younger officer hesitated, his eyes scanning her posture, her composure, the way she carried herself. He didn't immediately jump to conclusions. But Daniels cut him off before he could respond. "She's stalling. I've seen this trick before. Act calm, act polite, act innocent, but the story always falls apart." Angela's jaw tightened. The dismissal wasn't just insulting, it was dangerous. She had stood in too many courtrooms where assumptions led to wrongful arrests, where bias overrode facts, where dignity was stripped from people who deserved better, and now she was living that very nightmare. The crowd around them had grown larger. Parents held their children back, whispering about what they were seeing. Phones hovered high, catching every exchange. Some voices were sympathetic, murmuring support under their breath. Others were skeptical, waiting to see what would unfold. Angela's heart pounded with a mix of anger and disbelief. Here she was, a judge sworn to uphold justice, being paraded before her own neighbors as though she were a criminal. "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone sharper now. "You are making a serious mistake. I advise you to reconsider your words." But Daniels only smirked. "Is that supposed to scare me? Because if you're innocent, then you have nothing to worry about." Angela closed her eyes briefly, swallowing her frustration. Innocent until proven guilty. That's the foundation of the law. Yet here, I'm guilty until I can prove otherwise. The younger officer shifted uneasily. He glanced at Daniels, then back at Angela. "Maybe we should run the plates through the system, just to be sure," he suggested. But Daniels waved him off. We'll get to that. First, I want to know why she looks nervous. Why is she standing there like she's hiding? Something? Angela couldn't hold back her disbelief. Nervous? Of course I'm nervous. You've accused me of stealing my own car. You've dismissed my documents. You've called for backup as though I'm a threat. Wouldn't you be nervous in my shoes? The younger officer's gaze softened slightly, but Daniels remained unshaken. He leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough that only Angela could hear. People like you always slip up eventually, he whispered. Angela's breath caught in her throat. The implication was clear. He wasn't seeing her as a professional woman, a community leader, or even a law-abiding citizen. To him, she was already guilty. Her words, her proof, her very presence meant nothing. Her mind flashed to the countless defendants who had stood in her courtroom, pleading to be heard, insisting they were telling the truth. She had always prided herself on listening, on looking past appearances and into the facts. Now she understood, with chilling clarity, how terrifying it felt to stand on the other side of that judgment. The crowd sensed the tension building. A neighbor whispered loudly, "That's Judge Williams. I swear it is." Another voice answered, "Then why's he treating her like this?" Angela caught the words. Her identity was no longer a secret among the onlookers. Yet Daniels seemed oblivious, blinded by his determination to control the narrative. He pulled out his notepad again. "What were you doing driving around this neighborhood tonight?" he demanded. Angela raised her chin. "I live here. That's what I was doing. Driving home." The answer only seemed to fuel his disbelief. "Convenient," he muttered. Her patience thinned to a fragile thread. She felt a fire building inside her chest, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been dismissed, silenced, or humiliated in the face of false accusations. The younger officer cleared his throat. "Daniels, maybe we should—" But Daniels cut him off with a glare. "I've got this under control." Angela's eyes flicked to the crowd. Dozens of lenses were fixed on her, recording her every breath, her every reaction. A part of her wanted to scream out the truth, to end this ridiculous scene with a single declaration of who she was. But another part of her knew the timing had to be right. If she spoke too soon, it might be dismissed as desperation. If she waited, the truth could hit harder, undeniable and unforgettable. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The officer's words, the flashing lights, the whispers of neighbors, it all blurred into one surreal moment. And in that moment, Angela realized something chilling. It wasn't just her car or her reputation at stake. It was the very principle of justice she had devoted her life to defending. If she couldn't stand up for herself here, how could she ever stand for others in her courtroom again? *. The flashing lights seemed brighter now, bouncing off every surface and turning the quiet street into a spectacle. What had started as a simple stop had become the neighborhood's evening drama. People gathered at the edge of their lawns, whispering, pointing, and recording. Some shook their heads, some crossed their arms, but all eyes were locked on Judge Angela Williams. Though none of them knew yet who she really was, Angela stood tall, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to maintain control of her breathing. She reminded herself silently, patience, composure, timing. These were the tools she relied on in her courtroom, and now she was forced to use them on herself. But Officer Daniels seemed determined to push her past her limit. "Ma'am," he said in a voice loud enough for the crowd to hear, "the more you stall, the more suspicious this looks. If you've got something to hide, now's the time to admit it." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the bystanders. The teenagers recording whispered commentary as though they were live streaming the event. "She doesn't look guilty," one said softly. "But he's not letting up." Angela's lips parted, then closed again. She had 1,000 words on her tongue, but she swallowed them back. She could feel her pulse in her temples, her dignity hanging in the balance. The younger officer, who had arrived as backup, finally spoke again. "Daniels, I really think we should check the system. It'll take 30 seconds to confirm ownership." "No harm in that," but Daniels shot him a look of disdain. "I know what I'm doing. This car is flagged and she's playing games. I've seen it all before." His words carried through the air like a verdict, as though no further evidence was needed. The public theater of the stop made it worse. Every accusation he made painted Angela as guilty in the eyes of the crowd. And the longer it went on, the more the humiliation grew. Angela folded her arms, her composure cracking just enough to let out a controlled but sharp response. "You've had my documents for nearly 20 minutes. Yet instead of verifying them, you've chosen to grandstand. What exactly are you hoping to prove here?" Daniels bristled. "I don't take kindly to attitude, ma'am." The exchange triggered louder whispers among the onlookers. A man across the street muttered, "That's not attitude, that's frustration." A woman replied, "She's handling this better than most would. I'd be furious." The attention only seemed to feed Daniel's resolve. He straightened his shoulders, clearly aware of the cameras, and raised his voice. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle. We're going to search." Angela froze. Her heart raced, but her face remained calm. She could feel the collective intake of breath from the crowd, the tension so thick it seemed to hold the night itself. Still. "This is it," she thought. "If I comply, the humiliation deepens. If I resist, the situation escalates. Either way, I lose. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. His hand hovered near his belt, not in aggression, but in hesitation. "Daniels, maybe we should slow down." "She's cooperating. Let's not—" "Enough," Daniels snapped. "I don't need second guessing." Angela's eyes swept across the crowd. Dozens of phones pointed at her, capturing her every move. Their presence gave her strength. Whatever happened tonight, there would be a record. She wouldn't be just another story brushed aside. Summoning her inner calm, she spoke clearly, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. "Officer, I am not resisting, but I need you to understand something very important. You are about to make a grave mistake." Daniels laughed under his breath. "That's what they all say." The remark stung, but Angela held her ground. She knew her truth, and she knew the power of patience. Every second that passed built the weight of the reveal she was holding back. The younger officer, visibly unsettled, finally stepped aside and walked back toward his patrol car. Angela noticed his hesitation. Perhaps he suspected there was more to this story than Daniels realized. But Daniels remained unshaken, his determination unwavering. The crowd pressed in closer now, though still careful to keep their distance. Parents whispered warnings to their children, urging them to watch quietly. Some neighbors whispered her name, recognition dawning slowly. "That's her," one man murmured. "That's Judge Williams. I saw her on the news last month." "Judge?" another asked, incredulous. Angela heard it. Her pulse quickened. The truth was creeping closer, even if she hadn't spoken it yet. The weight of the moment was almost unbearable. Daniels, oblivious to the whispers, extended his hand. "Last chance. Turn around and cooperate, or this gets harder for you." Angela locked eyes with him, her calm gaze meeting his unwavering stare. She didn't flinch. She didn't move. Inside, Her decision crystallized. The time for silence was almost over. The lights flickered across her face, the cameras zoomed in, and the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The escalation had reached its peak. And soon, very soon, the world would know exactly who Angela Williams really was. Asterisk. The neighborhood was silent except for the hum of patrol car engines and the rhythmic flash of red and blue lights. Dozens of eyes were on Angela, and dozens of phones captured her every breath. Officer Daniels stood firm, hand hovering near his holster, his voice sharp and commanding. "Turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." Now, Angela inhaled slowly, steadying herself. She had spent her career teaching others to measure their words carefully, to understand that timing could make all the difference. And tonight, timing was everything. Her patience had been stretched to its breaking point. She had complied, she had explained, she had offered proof, and yet she stood accused, dismissed, and humiliated before her own neighbors. Enough was enough. Angela reached for her purse resting on the hood of her car. Daniels tensed immediately, his hand gripping his holster tighter. Slowly, he barked. "What are you doing?" Angela's voice was calm, deliberate, every word echoing with authority. "I'm about to put an end to this nonsense." The crowd leaned forward, curiosity spiking. The teenagers recording zoomed in with their phones, whispering, "What's she gonna do?" From her purse, Angela pulled out a slim leather wallet, black, worn from years of use. She opened it carefully and revealed her official identification card. The bold letters gleamed under the patrol lights. County Court Judge Angela Williams. She held it up high, her hand steady, her gaze unyielding. "Officer Daniels," she said, her voice carrying across the street. "I am Judge Angela Williams, and you have just spent the last 30 minutes accusing a sitting judge of stealing her own vehicle." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Murmurs erupted like waves. "She's a judge? Oh my God, I knew she looked familiar." "He's done for." Daniel's expression shattered in an instant. The authority he wore like armor melted into disbelief. His jaw slackened, his hand slipped from his holster, and his eyes darted between the ID card and Angela's piercing stare. The younger officer, who had remained cautious throughout, leaned closer to glimpse the ID. His face shifted quickly from curiosity to shock. He took a small step back, as though realizing he had just stumbled into a career-defining moment. Angela didn't waver. She lowered the ID slightly but kept her voice firm, ensuring every bystander heard. "You had every opportunity to verify my documents. You had every chance to treat me with dignity. Instead, you dismissed me. You ignored facts, and you chose humiliation over truth, and you did it in front of witnesses." Daniels stammered, words tumbling out in fragments. I didn't know. I thought—" "You thought wrong," Angela interrupted sharply. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were judging. Their whispers carried a mix of awe and condemnation. The teenagers recording grinned, whispering to their phones, "This is going viral, like tomorrow morning viral." Daniels's hands fumbled at his belt as he tried to regain composure. His confidence, once so unshakable, was gone. "Judge Williams, I was only following procedure," he insisted weakly. Angela raised an eyebrow. "Procedure? The procedure checks registration when it's provided. The procedure is verifying facts before making accusations. What you followed tonight was not procedure. It was prejudice." The younger officer cleared his throat nervously. "Judge Williams, I apologize. If you'd like, I can run the plates right now to confirm." "There's no need," Angela cut him off, her voice icy. "This has gone far beyond confirmation." Daniel's eyes flicked toward the cameras surrounding them. He knew what this meant. Every second of his arrogance, his dismissal, his baseless accusations, they were all captured on dozens of phones. There would be no rewriting this story. No hiding behind excuses. Angela closed her wallet and slipped it back into her purse. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and filled with a quiet strength. She turned her gaze back to Daniels, locking him in place with a stare that carried the weight of her years on the bench. "You wanted to make an example of me tonight," she said. "And you did. But not the way you intended." The crowd erupted, in murmurs again, their phones capturing every word, every flicker of Daniel's paling face. Angela stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She lowered her voice so only he could hear, though the cameras still captured her poised demeanor. "Your career," she whispered, "ended the moment you ignored the truth standing right in front of you. Daniels swallowed hard, his confidence crumbling to dust. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His silence said more than any excuse ever could. The younger officer shifted awkwardly, clearly torn between loyalty to his colleague and the undeniable truth unfolding before him. Angela turned back toward the crowd, her chin held high. "This situation is over," she declared. "You've all witnessed enough." The audience didn't cheer, but the energy shifted. They knew history had just been made on their street. A judge had been forced to defend her own dignity, and she had done it with the kind of power that no badge could silence. And Officer Daniels? He stood frozen, his career slipping away with every recording light that blinked at him from the crowd. The reveal was complete. But for Angela, the battle wasn't over yet. The fallout was only beginning. The street was no longer just a stage. It was a courtroom without walls. The flashing lights were spotlights. The neighbors were the jury, and Angela Williams was both victim and witness. Officer Daniels, once confident and commanding, now looked like a man cornered by his own mistakes. The silence that followed her reveal was deafening. Dozens of phones stayed raised, their tiny red lights blinking like unblinking eyes. Every second was being documented, immortalized. Angela stood tall, her ID tucked away once more, her dignity restored in the eyes of the crowd. But she wasn't. "Finished? Not yet." "Officer Daniels," she said, her tone sharp but calm. "You didn't just question me. You dismissed proof, ignored procedure, and humiliated me in front of my community. That is not law enforcement. That is abuse of authority." The younger officer shifted nervously. "Judge Williams, if I may, we can file an internal report and—" Angela cut him off with a raised hand. "No need to explain. The evidence speaks for itself." She gestured subtly toward the crowd, their cameras still rolling. Daniels' face burned red under the strobe of lights. "Judge, please. I didn't realize who you were. I thought—" Angela's eyes narrowed. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't think. Or rather, you thought you already knew everything you needed. You thought my words weren't worth hearing, my documents weren't worth checking. You saw me, and you decided I couldn't. Possibly belong to this car, to this neighborhood, to this life." Her words echoed across the street, cutting through the night air like a verdict. Murmurs rose again, sharp and biting. "She's right." He didn't even try to check the plates. "This is going to ruin him." Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but the younger officer stepped forward, his voice trembling with the weight of truth. "She's right, Daniels. We should have run the plates the moment she handed over her registration. We should have treated this like a procedure, not a suspicion." Daniels turned on him sharply. "Whose side are you on?" The younger officer hesitated, then squared his shoulders. "The side of the law." The crowd reacted audibly. Some gasped, some muttered, but all of them felt the shift. The partnership between the officers was cracking in plain view. Angela remained still, letting the silence stretch, letting Daniels stew in the weight of his crumbling authority. Every second that passed made his position weaker, his excuses thinner. Finally, Daniels took a step back, his voice lowering, desperate. "Judge Williams, if we could just handle this privately—" "Privately," Angela repeated, her tone cutting. "After you made a spectacle of me in front of my neighbors? After you turned a routine stop into a public humiliation? No, officer, you chose the stage. Now you'll face the audience." The teenager's recording whispered excitedly. "She's destroying him. This is gold." Daniel's eyes darted around, searching for an escape. But there was none. Every camera was a lock on the door. Every whisper was another nail in the coffin of his career. Angela straightened, her voice now carrying the weight of finality. "You wanted control tonight. You had it. But what you forgot is that control without justice is empty. And tonight, justice will be remembered, not your commands." The younger officer looked down, shame flickering across his face, as he realized the truth in her words. Daniels, however, stood frozen, his authority dissolving into nothing more. Then the flashing lights reflecting off his badge. One of the neighbors spoke loudly from across the street, breaking the tension. "We'll be sending these videos to the department, to the news too." Daniel's head whipped toward the voice, panic flashing across his features. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His career was no longer slipping. It was gone, evaporating. Before his eyes, Angela turned back to her car, her purse once again in hand. Her composure was flawless, her movements deliberate. She looked back only once, her gaze fixed on Daniels. "Your badge may grant you authority," she said coldly, "but it does not grant you the right to strip others of their dignity. Remember that, if you ever wear it again." The words landed, like a gavel-striking wood dot. The crowd erupted in murmurs once more, some shaking their heads, others nodding in agreement. The younger officer lowered his eyes, unable to meet Angela's gaze. And Daniels? He stood motionless, the weight of the moment crushing him from all sides. Angela stepped back into her car, the soft click of the door closing punctuating the night. The crowd watched as she adjusted her seatbelt, started the engine, and prepared to leave. The flashing lights no longer felt intimidating. They felt hollow, empty symbols of power that had just been stripped away. As she pulled out onto the street, the cameras followed her until her car disappeared into the distance. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their voices weaving together into a single truth. Justice had been served. Not in a courtroom, but right there on the pavement. Daniels remained in the glow of the flashing lights, his career hanging by a thread that would soon be cut. And he knew it. For Judge Angela Williams, the night wasn't about proving ownership of a car. It was about proving ownership of her dignity and reminding everyone watching that truth will always outshine assumption. And for Daniels, the night was the end of a career built on authority without accountability. The cameras had captured everything. The world would soon know. The following morning, the neighborhood was buzzing. The videos from last night had already spread across social media like wildfire. Clips of Judge Angela Williams standing tall, flashing her ID, and calmly dismantling. Officer Daniels' accusations were everywhere. On news feeds, community forums, even morning talk shows. Headlines blared across the screen. Local judge confronts officer over false accusations. Caught on camera, the night justice spoke back. Viral video shows officer accusing judge of stolen car. Angela sat in her chambers at the courthouse, the faint hum of the morning, traffic drifting through the windows. She had spent years presiding over cases of truth and lies, justice and error, but never had she imagined becoming the center of such a story herself. Her assistant, Clara, peeked into the office, holding a tablet. "Judge Williams, it's everywhere. The department has already issued a statement. They said they're launching a full investigation." Angela leaned back in her chair, her hands folded calmly in front of her. "As they should." Clara hesitated. "You really ended his career last night, didn't you?" Angela shook her head gently. "I didn't end it. He did. The moment he chose arrogance over procedure, assumption over fact, that was the moment his career ended. I only showed him the mirror." Meanwhile, at the precinct, Officer Daniels was pacing like a trapped animal. His phone buzzed non-stop. Calls from superiors, messages from fellow officers, even reporters wanting a statement. Each vibration was another reminder that his authority, once untouchable, was now under siege. His commanding officer summoned him into a meeting room. The captain's expression was grim, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Daniels, the video speaks for itself. You ignored registration, refused to run plates, escalated without cause, and you did it to a sitting judge. We can't protect you from this." Daniel stammered, his face pale. I didn't know who she was. That's exactly the point, the captain snapped. It shouldn't matter who she was. Procedure doesn't change based on identity. And you broke. And on camera. The community has lost trust. The department has lost credibility. And you, Daniels, you've lost your badge. The words cut deeper than any punishment. Daniels slumped in his chair, realizing this was the end. The very badge he had used as a shield now lay stripped away. Because he had forgotten what it truly stood for, back in her courtroom, Angela presided over her cases as though nothing had changed. But in the back of her mind, she carried the weight of the previous night. Not as a burden, but as a lesson. She had faced humiliation, but she had responded not with anger, but with truth. And in doing so, she reminded everyone watching that justice is not bound to the walls of a courthouse. It can unfold on any street, under any set of flashing lights. Later that evening, Angela returned home. Her neighbors were gathered outside, waiting to greet her. Some clapped softly as she walked up the street. Others simply nodded with quiet respect. One of the teenagers, the same one who had filmed the entire encounter, stepped forward nervously. "Judge Williams," he said, holding up his phone. "That video, it's got over 2 million views already. People keep saying how powerful you were, how you didn't back down." Angela smiled kindly. It wasn't about not backing down. It was about standing up for truth, for dignity, for the law itself. If that inspires others, then I'm grateful. The teen nodded, his eyes shining. It inspired me. The crowd slowly dispersed, but the energy remained. The community now looked at Angela not just as a judge in the courthouse, but as a symbol of resilience right in their neighborhood. That night, Angela sat by her window, the city lights twinkling in the distance. She thought about Daniels, not with anger, but with a quiet sense of closure. His downfall wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Justice wasn't about crushing someone, but about reminding them, and everyone else, that truth matters. No matter who you are, the world would move on. The headlines would fade, but the lesson would remain etched in every heart that had watched the video. Assumptions have consequences, arrogance has a price, and dignity, when defended, has the power to change the course of events. Angela whispered, softly to herself, as though delivering her final verdict. Justice isn't always served in court. Sometimes it's served in the streets, under the watchful eyes of those who refuse to forget. And with that, she closed her eyes, at peace, with the knowledge that justice had indeed turned the tables, this time for her.